There's a berry that once lined nearly every country road in America and across most of Europe. It clung to fence posts, tangled through hedgerows, crawled along stone walls and field borders wherever the land met the edge of human intention. It was small, bright red, sometimes orange, and so common that most people who passed it every day of their lives never thought to call it remarkable. But it was. Ounce for ounce, it carried more vitamin C than almost any fruit on the continent. Some measurements placed it at 5 times the concentration found in an orange. Others, depending on the species and the time of harvest, recorded levels far higher than that. It was free. It was everywhere. And within a few decades, most of it was gone. The berry is the rosehip, the small round or oval fruit left behind after a wild rose finishes blooming. Not the cultivated roses sold in florist shops, the ones bred for petal count and fragrance until they barely produce fruit at all. The old roses, the wild ones. Rosa canina, the dog rose, and its American cousins that sprawled along pasture edges and ditch banks from Maine to Missouri and deep into the upper South. These plants were not decorative. They were functional parts of a living agricultural landscape. Their thorned canes kept livestock in and predators wary. Their roots held soil on slopes and along waterways where nothing else was planted. And every autumn they produced thousands upon thousands of small red fruits that were quietly one of the most nutrient-dense foods available to ordinary people, without spending a single cent. The use of rose hips as food and medicine is older than any written record in the English language. Roman soldiers are believed to have carried them on long campaigns. Medieval herbalists across Europe prescribed them for ailments of the chest and stomach. In Scandinavia, rose hip soup was a household staple for centuries, served warm in winter as both nourishment and remedy. Across Central Europe, dried rose hips were ground into flour and mixed into bread during lean years when grain harvests fell short. The knowledge of what these berries contained was not scientific in the modern sense. It was experiential. Communities knew that when they ate them through the cold months, people stayed healthier. They knew that children with steady access to the fruit were less likely to fall seriously ill before spring. The understanding was practical, woven into the rhythm of rural life, and passed along without ceremony or documentation. That quiet knowledge became something far more urgent during the Second World War. When German U-boats cut Britain's Atlantic supply lines, citrus imports collapsed almost overnight. Oranges and lemons, which had become the assumed source of vitamin C for the British population, simply stopped arriving in meaningful quantities. The Ministry of Health faced a genuine nutritional emergency. Scurvy, a disease most people associated with 18th century sailing ships, became a real and present threat to the civilian population, particularly children and the elderly. The solution did not come from a laboratory or a pharmaceutical company. It came from the hedgerows. In 1941, the British government launched a nationwide campaign asking volunteers to collect wild rose hips from the countryside. Parish councils organized collection points. Schools sent children out in groups with baskets. Elderly residents of rural villages who could no longer contribute to the war effort in other ways walked the lanes and filled sacks with the small red fruits. The response was extraordinary. In the first full season, hundreds of tons were collected entirely by hand. The harvest was delivered to regional processing centers, where it was made into national rose hip syrup, bottled and distributed free to families with young children and to hospitals across the country. At its peak, the program brought in over 450 tons of wild rose hips in a single year. A tablespoon of the resulting syrup delivered more vitamin C than a full glass of fresh orange juice. Britain did not solve its wartime vitamin crisis with industrial chemistry. It solved it by remembering what had been growing along every hedge and footpath for centuries. In America, the same wild roses grew in enormous abundance. They lined the old fence rows that divided small family farms across the Midwest and the Northeast. They tangled through the hedgerows that had been planted or allowed to grow as windbreaks, livestock barriers, and property boundaries stretching from Ohio to Kansas and from Virginia to the Dakotas. These were not ornamental landscapes. They were working edges, the borders between one field and the next, between cultivated ground and the wild ground that held everything together. And in those borders, an entire ecology thrived. Wild roses grew alongside elderberry, hawthorn, wild plum, wild grape, and dozens of other species that provided food, medicine, and habitat without anyone needing to plant, irrigate, or tend them. It was provision without cost, abundance without input. What happened to those hedgerows is one of the quieter agricultural tragedies of the 20th century. It did not arrive as a single catastrophic event. It came through a sequence of economic pressures and policy decisions that most people experience not as destruction, but as modernization. After the Second World War, American agriculture entered a period of rapid consolidation. Small farms merged into larger operations. The economic logic was straightforward and relentless. Bigger fields allowed more efficient use of increasingly expensive machinery. A tractor pulling a wide implement does not want to navigate around a hedge every few hundred feet. Fence rows and hedgerows, which had shaped the American rural landscape for over a century, came to be seen not as living infrastructure, but as obstacles to efficiency. They occupied plantable acreage. They harbored insects that might damage cash crops. They complicated the geometry of aerial spraying. One by one, across millions of acres, they were bulldozed, burned, or chemically killed. The herbicides accelerated the destruction beyond anything physical removal alone could have accomplished. Broadleaf herbicides like 2,4-D, developed originally from wartime chemical research, became standard tools of row crop farming in the 1950s and 60s. They were devastatingly effective at killing exactly the kinds of plants that defined hedgerow ecology. Wild roses, with their deep root systems and sprawling woody canes, were primary casualties. County extension agents encouraged farmers to clear weedy fence lines. Government cost-sharing programs in some regions paid farmers directly to remove hedgerows and consolidate fields into larger, cleaner blocks. The USDA promoted what it called clean farming, an approach that treated any non-crop vegetation as inefficiency to be corrected. The rose hips vanished not because anyone studied them and concluded they were useless. They vanished because they occupied space that a spreadsheet said should be growing corn. This pattern deserves attention because it repeats throughout the modern history of American food. A free, nutrient-dense, locally available food source is displaced not by something better, but by an economic structure that has no way to account for its value. The hedgerow rose hip generated no revenue for anyone. It required no purchased inputs. It could not be patented, branded, or sold through a distribution channel. In an agricultural economy increasingly organized around purchase seed, purchase fertilizer, purchase chemical application, and commodity market sales, a plant that simply grew on its own and fed people for nothing was economically invisible. And in a system that responds only to economic signals, invisible things do not survive. The sheer scale of what was lost is difficult to grasp from where most Americans stand today. Conservative estimates suggest that the United States lost well over 1 million miles of hedgerow and fence line habitat between 1940 and 1980. Across the Midwest, landscapes that had been a dense patchwork of small bordered fields became open industrial plains within a single generation. A farmer who grew up walking past rose hips every morning on the way to the barn might have lived to see nothing but soybeans from one horizon to the other. With the hedgerows went not only the wild roses, but entire networks of pollinator habitat, bird nesting corridors, small mammal shelter, and deep-rooted soil stabilization. Wind erosion spiked. Pollinator populations declined, and a source of one of the most important vitamins in the human diet, available to anyone willing to walk a quarter mile with a bucket, simply ceased to exist across most of the regions where it had been most plentiful. Now, consider where we are. The average American household spends more on vitamins and dietary supplements than any previous generation in history. The supplement industry surpassed $50 billion in annual domestic revenue several years ago and continues to climb. Vitamin C tablets alone represent a massive commercial category, and rose hip extract specifically has become a premium ingredient in both the supplement and skincare markets, imported primarily from Chile, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe, dried, processed, encapsulated, and sold at prices that would seem hallucinatory to anyone who once filled a bushel basket from the nearest fence line without leaving their own property. The nutrient that once grew free along every rural boundary in America is now shipped across oceans in branded packaging. There is something worth sitting with in that sequence, not because it is exceptional, but because it is so perfectly typical of a larger pattern. Abundance is destroyed, scarcity is created, and then the thing that was lost is sold back to the people who once had it for nothing. No one planned it as a single conspiracy. It is simply the end result of a system that converts everything, even gifts from the land, into transactions. The wild roses have not been entirely erased. They survive in places the machinery and the sprayers did not reach. Along abandoned rail corridors, on the margins of national forest land, in old cemeteries and untended churchyards where no one has mowed in decades, along coastal dunes and in the rough corners of state wildlife areas. They can still be found if you know what you are looking for. A wild rose blooms with 5 simple petals, usually pink or white, nothing resembling the heavy layered flowers of commercial garden varieties. After the petals fall, the hip swells through summer and ripens to red or deep orange by early autumn. Experienced foragers harvest after the first frost, when cold concentrates the sugars and softens the flesh. The fine hairs and seeds inside must be strained out carefully, but the remaining fruit can be dried for tea, simmered into syrup, or cooked into preserves that keep through winter. The vitamin C content remains among the highest of any fruit growing in the temperate world. Some people have begun putting them back. Small-scale permaculture operations and hedgerow restoration projects are reintroducing wild roses along field edges and property boundaries, often planted alongside hawthorn, elderberry, and native plum. It is patient work. A proper hedge takes years to fill in, but wild roses are tenacious, drought-tolerant, and remarkably self-sufficient once established. They require no irrigation in most climates, no fertilization, no chemical management. They grow, hold the soil, shelter pollinators through bloom season, and produce fruit every autumn without being asked. What was sprayed into oblivion across those millions of miles of American fence line was not just a berry. It was a relationship between ordinary people and the land they lived beside. A relationship in which the margins of the landscape were not waste ground to be cleaned up, but provision to be gathered. Not empty space, but quiet, steady abundance. The rose hip needed no industry to deliver it, no supply chain, no refrigerated truck, no import tariff, no marketing campaign. It needed only to be left alone and allowed to do what it had done for thousands of years. And that made